Hello, and welcome to Simply Scintillating, the low-maintenance way for you to shine. I'm your host, Cyn. On today's show, diet is a four-letter word, we're going to be sort of addressing some of the popular diet myths and debunking the pseudoscience behind many fad diets. Joining me is registered dietitian Jen Jasmine. Welcome, Jen.
Hi, Cyn. Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, let's just jump right in with myth number one. Carbs make you fat. Now, I remember my mom decided she was a carbohydrate addict. She went on one of those diets, lost a ton of weight, but a year later, she put it all back on. And that's sort of the thinking behind the Atkins and the carb busters. So why is it these diets sort of work in the short term, but long term, not so much?
So the truth is, too much of anything can make you fat, honestly. I think carbohydrates right now get a bad rap, largely because of Atkins diets and South Beach diets and paleo diets rising in popularity. And the truth is, they do give results. Unfortunately, for most people, they're temporary results. And that mostly has to do with the fact that the diets are not sustainable long term. Anything that tells you to cut out a major macronutrient group, and that would be carbs, protein, or fat, is not something you can do for the rest of your life. So these diets often sell you on a short period of time. Think of things that say things like 3-day this, 21-day that, 4-month cure. The idea is that they're giving you hope that you can get through a period of time using willpower, and then you'll get to go right back to the way you used to eat. And that's what everyone kind of does in these types of diets is truthfully, they're really hoping to go right back to what they used to do, which is often what people do. So they lose the weight on this low carb type diet, but there's never a what's next plan included in these diet books. So at the end of said period of time, most people assume that they can go right back to doing what they were doing before, and the weight trickles back on, unfortunately. The science is that carbohydrates, though incredibly necessary, actually attract water. They're what's called hydrophilic. And in our bodies, that's a good thing. But because eating a big bowl of pasta would attract water in your body, let's face it, water has weight. In the absence of a lot of carbohydrates, the first thing you lose is water weight, and that happens quite quickly. So it is the type of thing that someone who's looking for weight loss is often encouraged by. Oh, great, this 3 pounds, 4 pounds, 5 pounds came off really quickly. I'm going to keep going on fill in the blank plan. So it does sort of perpetuate the system, but then once again, at the end of the diet, they're kind of left wondering what comes next.
Okay, all right, so let's address another one of these micronutrients, protein. And myth number 2. Vegetarians don't get enough protein or the right amino acids. Well, the truth is Americans get more protein than they need. So what's this whole protein, amino acid, and could you just explain that?
Sure. Again, going back to this idea of Atkins, South Beach, paleo, protein kind of comes out these days as the hero. And almost eat as much as you want. Protein is something that's going to, save you from gaining weight. Once again, too much of anything can cause you to gain weight, so it's really not something that we all should be thinking of as a free food, so to speak. The thing about protein is it's made up of something called amino acids, which are literally building blocks, kind of like Legos. So when we eat foods that are high in protein, we break those amino acids apart, and then our bodies are able to use them to construct things, most famously muscle, but also enzymes and hormones and other very important things in the body. The kicker is, most Americans do already get enough protein. There's a little bit of misinformation there, though, because oftentimes Americans get plenty, if not too much protein, all at one meal. If you think about how many of us eat, it might be a bowl of cereal at breakfast, and things like rice and almond milk are very popular right now, which are actually much lower in protein than cow's milk. Then you look to lunchtime. Maybe you have a salad or sandwich, and perhaps there's not a piece of chicken or tuna or tofu or edamame on there. Then when we get to dinner, this is where Americans often get far too much. So it tends to be that we don't actually consume enough protein throughout the day, but we get too much at one meal. We'll have a giant steak that may have 60 grams of protein. Quite frankly, the body can't even use that much at one time.
Oh.
So it's an interesting little trend that's happening right now is protein looks like a hero, but we're kind of doing it wrong. At least a lot of people are.
All right, and then the whole idea of the vegetarians.
Exactly, you did mention that point. So it is absolutely possible, and truthfully speaking, not that difficult for vegetarians to get enough protein. There's protein in almost every plant food. It just varies in how much. We're so inclined to try and peg foods into these categories of macronutrients, like what's a protein, what's a carb, what's a fat. But truthfully, almost no food is just one of those things. Everything is a combination. Even broccoli is going to have a little protein. So when you add up throughout the day plant-based foods, you can definitely get to plenty of protein. The problem tends to come in that people don't quite do it the right way, again, and they may wind up with too much of something, too much of carbohydrate or too much of fat.
Okay, well, speaking of plant protein, let's go on to myth number 3. Gluten is the root of all your problems.
And I'm so glad you asked it that way, Cyn, because gluten is a protein. People don't really realize that because gluten is a component of a lot of foods that are rich in carbohydrates. Like, take bread, for example. We all would say, oh, bread is a carb for sure, right? Okay, well, what's inside of the bread, what's inside of the wheat is actually a little bit of this protein called gluten. It is, again, being kind of villainized right now, but a small percentage of our population actually has a medical reason to avoid it. And if you do, you must, or you'll get very sick, and it's a very serious matter. For the rest of us, what tends to be happening that I see is people who cut gluten out of their diets inadvertently are cutting out things like pasta and bread. Therefore, they're low-carb dieting. It's just it's got a different name. So back to your question number 1 about carbs, unless this is a lifestyle that you intend to sustain, and if for a medical reason, absolutely you should do it. When you bring back in carbohydrates, especially like breads and pastas, if you're trying to go gluten-free for weight loss, it's not the best way to do it. It really is something that, again, can bring protein to a vegetarian diet and can be quite healthy.
Okay, well, is a lot of the bloating and the lethargy a lot of people associate with gluten? I mean, could that just be that they've just eaten this bakery product that, it has full of refined starches and sugars?
Absolutely. I mean, again, if you're cutting out muffins, and let's say you would go to Dunkin' Donuts every single day for a multi-grain muffin that you've thought your whole life was healthy, and then you give up gluten, so you're cutting out the muffin, well, you're also cutting out saturated fats and a tremendous amount of sugar. Either of those things could have been leading to your bloating feeling as well. Right. But this is a great time for me to tell you that, truthfully, there are only 2 golden rules that apply to everyone's diet. And it's probably not what you think.
Okay.
There's such a thing as too much of a good thing.
Okay, yes, I know that.
That is one.
Yes.
And the second is the absence of harm is not the same as beneficial.
Okay, that's a new one.
Sometimes we hear that, butter is back, for instance, all over the media. So suddenly people interpret that as butter must be good for me. I can have as much as I want.
Oh, well, look at those French.
Look at the French, right? Well, just because something may not be villainized or looked at as harmful doesn't necessarily mean eating copious amounts is good for us.
So it's not a free-for-all.
It's not. Well, it shouldn't be.
Well, speaking of butter, let's go on to fats. And this myth is sort of a 2-part contradictory. You've got the fat is bad, avoid fats, and then as long as you eat good fats like avocados and nuts and fish, you can have as much as you want. So
I would ask you, if you were answering this question for someone, what would you be imagining their goal is? Are you speaking to a person trying to lose weight, or are we talking about someone who's looking out for their heart and heart health?
It seems to be touted as a heart-healthy thing.
Exactly. Just because something is healthy doesn't necessarily mean it's in keeping with a lot of people's weight management goals. The job that I have happens to be in a health and sports club, so I see a ton of weight loss clients. Oftentimes, they're also looking to protect their heart. They may be trying to get off a statin medication for cholesterol or reduce their blood pressure. So unfortunately, the media can give us this information that's incredibly confusing. If I want to protect my heart, eat more healthy fats, eat that, salmon and olive oil and avocado. But I'm also trying to lose weight, and those things have a lot of calories. So again, the takeaway message is really that they're not free. It's not eat as much as you want and you'll be healthy, because it could lead to weight gain. It's try to replace the other fats with these healthy things. So again, back to that idea of a Dunkin' Donuts muffin that may be very high in saturated fat because they've baked it with butter and or oil and or, old-fashioned Crisco, which has trans fats in it. If you replace that with salmon or avocado, eggs even have a lot of healthy fats in them. So for instance, taking that muffin and replacing it with a low-calorie whole grain English muffin that has an egg and a slice of avocado on it, you may arrive at the same number of grams of fat, but you've got a much better fat for your health. And that's kind of the fat myth. It's not that one is, you can't really eat one in mass quantity versus the other. It's that you may be doing yourself a huge favor by picking which kind of fats you're having.
Okay.
It's a complicated issue.
Yeah. All right. Well, now we've sort of touched on Atkins, South Beach, paleo, and of course there's raw, vegan. I can't name. Oh, and the infamous grapefruit diet.
And don't forget cabbage soup.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. So these diets all essentially tell you to eliminate an entire food group or force you to eat specific foods.
Right.
So what's your take on those?
So as it turns out, I actually, a few years ago, much to my family's dismay, started collecting vintage diet books because I just find some of them to be pure comedy. And it's also a representation when I'm teaching and lecturing that I can show people sort of the absurdity and the comedy of some of past diets so that we can draw some of that absurdity and comedy into current diets. But you're absolutely right. There are some that tell you to only eat one thing and you'll get to your goal. And there are others that require you to cut out something perfectly healthy. The unfortunate truth is for most of us, the idea of eliminating something entirely for a short period of time is actually more appealing than making long-term dietary change that might require us to regulate something. Maybe only have pasta twice a week as opposed to every day. For a lot of people who are just starting on a diet journey, it can actually feel more approachable to say, okay, it's only this 2-week period that I'm not allowed X, Y, and Z. I can get through that. I always say diet is sort of, as you said, a 4-letter word. It starts with the root word die, which is how most people think they're going to feel on a diet. And it ends with the word T, which generally stands for temporary. Because again, cabbage soup, Atkins, they don't give you a what's next, how to live your life healthfully to keep the weight off that you might have lost. Most, even of these crazy diets, have some sort of root in good science, but unfortunately they get manipulated in ways that sell books.
So basically, ultimately, they end up leading to an unhealthy relationship with food that ultimately causes chronic disease.
And yo-yoing. If your weight's going up and down and up and down, believe it or not, that's actually less healthy than having a slightly elevated weight consistently. And, it can really be emotionally upsetting when you find that you're gaining and losing and gaining and losing. The truth is, if weight loss is someone's goal, it really behooves people to think about what kind of changes they're willing and able to make for the long term. And that might mean starting small. Generally speaking, it's advantageous to look at what your diet might be missing before you think about what you have to deny yourself. Most of my clients, we start right off with, are you getting enough fiber? Are you getting enough vegetables? Are you getting enough protein at the right times of day? And then down the road, we talk about what may need to be curbed or limited or potentially cut out, but that's not usually the case.
Speaking of limited, the recent recommendations on sodium. Now, the World Health
topic.
the World Health Organization says you should get no more than 2 grams of sodium or 5 grams of table salt, which is like a teaspoon. But how do people? One says 2, one says 5. There's great confusion in all this. And is sea salt actually a low sodium alternative?
Whew, that's a big question, and it's one that has a lengthy answer. I'll try to keep this one short, I promise. So sodium and salt are not the same word. It's just like you said about amino acids being a part of protein or gluten being a part of a carbohydrate-based food. Sodium is something that's in the salts. Okay. So they don't actually equate by weight, salt and sodium.
Sodium chloride.
Exactly. You've got chloride in there in some instances. You have iodine if it's iodized salt. So by weight, table salt does not weigh the same as sodium.
Okay.
So for sure, the recommendations are very confusing. Also, I always get a kick out of recommendations on things like that because they're always in grams.
Yes.
Which we don't cook with in our country. So it can be even more confusing. How many teaspoons? What is that? Generally speaking, there's a quick and dirty way to know if a food is low sodium. And admittedly, this works mostly for packaged foods, but packaged foods are where we have the biggest problem in our country. That's where most of the sodium comes from. Table salt is a concern for actually a small percentage of the population. So take a can of soup. Mm-hmm. Easily, a serving of soup could have 700 milligrams of sodium, which is at least half of your day's worth there by those new guidelines.
Right.
So if you eat the whole can like most of us do, there's very little left in your sodium budget for the day.
Okay.
However, if you look at a nutrition label, this is just a quick and dirty way of knowing. If the calorie number, say it's 100, is less than or equal to the sodium number, you're in a good spot.
Oh, okay. That's
If that sodium number is dramatically higher than the calorie number, you're in trouble. So 500 milligrams of sodium compared to 100 of calories, high sodium food. 100 and 100, perfectly fine to purchase. Generally speaking, things that don't have labels. Chicken, beans, fish, plants.
As long as you get the dried beans, not the canned ones.
Correct, or the low sodium can. Those things have negligible amounts of naturally occurring sodium we don't need to worry too much about.
Okay.
Hope that answers your question. I told you it was a loaded one. Sea salt, I
Yes,
apologize,
sea
we
salt.
didn't cover that. Sea salt is still salt.
Okay.
Generally speaking, people find that they may use a bit less of it because it has texture and it's incredibly flavorful. Mm-hmm. If that helps someone consume a smaller volume of salt, great. If they're using the same, it's still the same.
Okay. So as a registered dietitian nutritionist,
Yes.
what are your recommendations for eating properly?
The truth of the answer is it depends on who's asking, because even the simplest bit of advice, like drink more water, isn't true for everyone. That being said, that's kind of my medical disclaimer. If you focus on getting more plants, if you focus on drinking more water, and you focus on moving more, you're bound to add health to your life. Again, turning the camera, so to speak, to the negative things and saying a healthy person cuts out sodium and cuts out sugar and cuts out saturated fat doesn't really help us all to figure out how to live. I find if you turn that around and really try to focus on what to have, we'll all be a bit better off.
So a variety of colorful plants.
Eat a rainbow, as they
All
say.
right.
Believe it or not, it works.
Well, thank you very much. This has been Simply Scintillating. I'm Cyn. Thanks for watching.